Welcome, Mr. Snowden.
Thank you. Well, I wasn't expecting that.
We don't have your...
Well, welcome, and Anne, are you beginning?
Yeah, I'm going to start just by saying hello. Welcome to Bard College. You opened your Twitter account by saying you are neither a hero nor a traitor, but a citizen with a voice. As another citizen with a voice, I would like to begin our conversation today by thanking you for being the catalyst of an energetic public debate about the nature of the relation between individual citizens and their rights, specifically their right not to be represented by a government that seizes private information unilaterally without our knowledge or consent. I think I probably speak for a number of people here and elsewhere. My question is very direct. We're coming to the end of two-day conference. Could you say why you think privacy matters, especially in relation to our idea of freedom? And could you also explain what you meant when you told Lawrence Lessig that you believe the right to privacy is a natural right?
When I think about this generally, when I think what compelled me to come forward, it's about much more than privacy. We talk in the context of privacy as a specific right, but what we're really discussing is the idea of liberty. What we're talking about our democracy. We're talking about the systems and processes in place that have control over the external forces that often intrude into the private domains of our lives, that reshape the boundaries of our rights and our societies. And privacy is really a word that's thrown around today, but it's not really understood. It's not by some even valued because it's not really explained what it means. And when people think, I don't care about privacy, or they say, why? They say, I don't have something to hide. I don't have something to hide. But privacy isn't about something to hide. Privacy is about something to lose. It's that safe space, that right to act and think and share without prejudgment, without every idea, every utterance being tracked and recorded and monitored and stored, whether that's by simply your peers in a small village, 1,000 years ago, or whether that's today as you engage in the normal activities that follow us around and surround us every day. Right now, you may be a student, you may use a lunch card in the cafeteria, and that leaves a permanent record of where you were at that time. It's not necessarily about what you're ordering for lunch. That doesn't mean you have something to hide. But what is occurring is that perfect records of private lives are being aggregated, they're being intercepted, they're being stored in a new, more intrusive manner and at a scale that's never happened before. Now, governments have always claimed this capability in edge cases. They've said, well, for the purposes of investigation of criminal activities and so on and so forth, we'll grant ourselves the authority to intrude into this individual's rights for the benefit of society more broadly, more generally. But that was very heavily checked and safeguarded by imposing individualized judicial oversight upon the process, by saying, if you want to intrude upon an individual's right, they don't go to the court and make a showing of why they have something to hide, because you don't need to justify your rights. And that's what I mean by natural right. I don't mean in a traditional philosophical sense. What I mean is that the burden of intrusion falls upon the intruder, not upon the one who is being intruded upon. You don't need to say why your rights are valuable to you in your particular case. You don't need to make a showing of vulnerability. You simply need to make a showing of humanity. You need to show that you're a person like any other, and that happens by virtue of your existence. And because of this, it is incumbent upon the government which is not granting the rights, it's simply guaranteeing the rights, it's protecting the rights. To make a showing through our processes that represent us in a civil society, to say this is a necessary cause, it's a necessary action because particularized, concrete, demonstrable harm will be shown to occur if this doesn't happen. Now, this is the warrant requirement. This is the probable cause that must be shown throughout courts. But in the darkness, without our knowledge, without our consent, this changed over the last several decades, beginning in the Bush administration, most aggressively, but continuing today. And this is something that I think we should all be wary of, because what it constitutes is the fact that we are no longer involved in traditional means of criminal investigation, of intelligence collection, and so on and so forth. Instead, we have a mass indiscriminate method of collection, which you can think of as pre-criminal investigation. Now, the government would say bulk collection isn't an intrusion. They would say that basically the mass surveillance that's occurring, that they euphemize as bulk collection, is tracking and monitoring, it's intercepting and aggregating and storing and analyzing all of your activities, but no individual's actually looking at those. They're monitoring you, but they're not necessarily reading you. They're storing your emails, they're tracking your calls, but they're not actually using those for some purpose. And this is also a violation of the Fourth Amendment, which prohibits not just unreasonable searches, of course, but the actual seizures to begin with, where they take things without that demonstration of individualized necessity. Rather than that probable cause that was just mentioned, today the standard for mass surveillance is what they call reasonable articulable suspicion, which is really a gut feeling that you can write down. And I engaged in this every day. You've simply got a little justification box that you type 3 words in. It takes fewer characters than writing a tweet to be able to say, I want to look at everything this person's ever done that's in our databases. And this is something I think that is extraordinary and really redefines what our relationship to the government is. And this is motivated.
Could I
Please.
just, I just want to ask you, right as you were saying that, whether you can trace some event or film or book that at the moment when, there must have been a moment when you made a decision, or maybe you made it over a long time ago, to exchange your private rights for becoming what you've called a citizen. Can you trace a little bit, can you say how that happened to you?
Right. So this is something that's actually, I think, a little bit unsatisfying for many journalists. They're always looking for that key moment.
I'm not a journalist.
I know, but I am. Trust me, I've got this before. It's because it is interesting to people, I think. But the idea here is that we want to think there's a switch. We want to think there's a moment where something instantly turns. But in my experience, it's actually a path. You know, when I was growing up, my father worked for the military, my mother worked for the federal government. Everyone in my family had some kind of connection. I grew up in the shadow of the NSA in Crofton and in Columbia, Maryland. And it was step by step that I actually became, over time, completely unquestioning of government. When others were protesting the Iraq War, I was actually signing up for it. In 2004, I was in the Army in basic training. By 2005, I was working for the NSA, or for the CIA as a contractor, and then as a CIA intelligence officer going overseas. And as this happened, it took a very long time for me to think of, you know, is there anything morally questionable about it? Because the language of government inside, internally within the machine of bureaucracy, is very self-certain and reassured. It's very confident because it speaks with the language of force. It speaks with the language of designation. Institutions, typically, they are meant to be bigger than individuals. And when you are an institution that preys upon individuals, which is the nature of intelligence and law enforcement largely, you have to recommend that you have to understand that from the perspective of those employees on the inside, there isn't really a moral argument that can be made from the outside. What got to me eventually over time was reporting, was newspapers, was sort of civil society reaching me step by step, piece by piece, and eventually seeing, of course, the promise of the Obama presidency, where he campaigned against or on the restriction of these programs, saying that we shouldn't have warrants wiretapping in America, and eventually seeing him walk away from that and say, you know, I won't hold even the highest members of society, like the president, who had admittedly broken the law and violated the Constitution, to the same account that ordinary people would do. I saw previous whistleblowers, individuals like Thomas Drake, stand up and show clear wrongdoing against everyone, go buy the book, go to 2 different inspector generals, go to the congressional intelligence committees, and say that something has to be done about this. And rather than them actually reforming the programs, rather than protecting him in any way, they referred him for prosecution. An investigation was opened. They tried to destroy his life. And in many ways, one could argue that they did. And it's this step by step where eventually we reach the point where I'm sitting, sort of in the NSA spaces. Now that I've moved from the CIA, I've worked in both human intelligence and signals intelligence. I've gained more and more access to broader and broader scope of information. And I realized that our public claims are not the same as the private realities of what's going on. And that, I think, will bother anyone. There's this cognitive dissonance where you can be a good person and tell yourself that you're doing bad things for good reasons for a very long time. But the burden of that increases over time because you think that dangerous activities, harmful activities, are exceptional activities. These are things that you do in periods of crisis that are necessary for the safety of the nation. But when you work with the products of intelligence, for example, you see that the way we're arguing for the passage of legislation is not actually on, we're arguing on the basis of public safety. But the real actual function of these programs is not about safety at all. It's about relative advantage. We want to outcompete. We want to outmaneuver. We're using authorities that were designed, or at least publicly claimed to be intended for stopping terrorist attacks in the wake of 9/11, to monitor US law firms that are involved in negotiations over the price of shrimp and clove cigarettes. And this gets to the point where we're in 2013, the very beginning of the year, legal challenges that have been worked for years by non-government organizations, by representatives, sort of in the community, in the non-governmental space, said they want to evaluate the constitutionality of these programs, which we knew had a large impact on us. But they said they couldn't. They lacked the authority to contest the government's claims that they weren't true. We couldn't prove that we were being spied on. And when our elected members of Congress said that, I know what's going on, to the Director of National Intelligence, the most senior intelligence official in the United States, James Clapper, and does the NSA, this is his quote, does the NSA collect any information, any records at all, on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans? And this intelligence officer under oath said, no, sir, not wittingly. And we knew that wasn't the case, but when we have information, when we understand what's going on, we can move to a different place. The courts can say we do have the facts, and we, the public, can return to our seat at the table of government. And I think that's really what it's all about. That was what I realized watching, really more than anything, the outcome of court cases, is if in a tripartite system where we have a separation of powers, one of the arms of government can be removed from the process, something has to give, something has to change, or we don't have the government that we believe we do. And that was very important to me.
Ed, it's Peter here. I'm interested to ask you about the duality of responses, or what seems to be the duality of responses to the disclosures that you've made. When you appeared on the screen here, there was a very immediate, rousing amount of applause and support. A couple of nights ago, however, at the Democratic presidential debate, all of the candidates were asked about you, and I think you were like the only person who was mentioned by name in that debate, whether they thought you had done the right thing or not. And as you probably know, all except for one said that you should be punished to one degree or another. And in particular, Hillary Clinton said he could have gotten the protections of being a whistleblower, he could have raised all the issues he's raised, and I think there would have been a positive response to that. He stole very important information that has unfortunately fallen into the wrong hands, so I don't think he should be brought home without facing the music. And so the question I'd like to ask you is, I mean, first I'm interested in your response to what Mrs. Clinton said, and I'm secondly interested to know kind of how you account for what appears to be this duality of response. There is certainly a measure of very popular support for what you have done. On the political level, perhaps not so much.
There is, I think, in many ways, a lack of political courage in the established class that we expect to champion us. Thank you. That was not actually meant to be an applause line. That was meant to be a little bit sad. But it's true, and I think everybody in the room feels that. Everyone in the nation feels that, and this is a point of friction in that, again, the relationship between the governing and the governed. We have a situation in which we have rising levels of inequality throughout all parts of society. Whether it's about the application of police violence, whether it's about the distribution of economy. Everyone in this room probably understands the problems with student debt obligations that can no longer be discharged. And while we know Hillary Clinton's claims are false here, and that's not my word for it, she was fact-checked yesterday. I actually just tweeted about this. If anybody wants to go to the primary documents and source material, twitter.com/Snowden. Because this is important, right? Truth should matter in politics, and courage should matter in politics, because we need change. Everyone knows we need change. And we have been aggrieved and in many ways misled by political leaders in the past. We recently had presidential elections where the entire platform was change we can believe in. And then when we got that, we unfortunately saw, rather than a new level of transparency and accountability reaching Washington, we saw an extension and increase in secrecy. The Obama administration has prosecuted more whistleblowers for their cooperation with journalists in publishing material of public interest that we all need to know than every other administration in the history of the United States combined. These are things that should alarm us. These are things that should concern us. But ultimately, when they're talking about me on the stage of the Democratic debate, this isn't something that makes me happy. This isn't something that makes me excited, because it's not about me. It's about us. It's about how we want our policies to look like in the future. It's about how we want to live. It's about the government that we want to have and participate and eventually, ultimately, hopefully, enjoy.
You've
and
said...
This, go on.
I just wanted to pick up on that word policy, because I heard you talk about policymakers at a certain moment, and I was very interested in your sense that people who make policy live in a kind of different space than people for whom that policy is supposed to be responding to. Maybe we all know that, but I thought your particular take on that, on the problem of policymakers, makes even that word for me now very suspect.
The real question, I think, or the real tension, the real problem to be resolved is, how do we set policy? How do we control policy? Who does policy represent? Unfortunately, because of the gaming of our political system, which was expected by everyone, this isn't something that I was thinking about, this is something the founders were thinking about, and we've seen gradually become difficult over time, is that each time we have an election, it's like another round in a game. All of the players, they have a contest, and then on the basis of the outcome, they learn lessons and they revise their strategy for the next time. Today, we're in a situation where policies are decided by policies, so policies are decided by parties more than they're decided by individual politicians. When you look at the different individuals comprising a party, you'll notice that their policy positions are almost identical. And in many cases, we're simply seeing that the most empowered groups within society, whether these are private businesses, whether these are elite interests, or some other groups, we see that they're able to influence both parties, and simply by virtue of working two steps there, typically through campaign donations and financial influence, they can shape the policies that we enjoy regardless of who takes office. Now, this isn't the case, of course, for certain tribal issues, for social issues that are chosen more as a team sport to identify what the differences are, than the impacts that will focus broadly the direction of the future of the entire society broadly. It's not to say that there are no differences at all between the parties, because of course there are, but it's about the limitation of choice. We're allowed to choose differences between two flavors, but not between really 535 different members of Congress, for example. They're all very much the same. And when we think about where this leads, right? So, okay, we get policy that's divorced from political, civil reality. We have policy that represents an elite class, sort of a class that's comprised of people who identify as politicians, who support the political system, and who largely don't want to see it change, or recognize that trying to change it, even if they want to, even if legitimately, they want to see reform, realize it's too difficult for them to do, and by attempting to organize it, they will make themselves a threat to parties and eventually be removed from power. We run into the situation where we realize it's reaching all parts of society. Secret policies are being created not by public, not even by politicians, but by bureaucrats behind closed doors who arrogate to themselves, who entitle themselves to powers with which they were not invested by either statute or the Constitution. The biggest organizations within society have been sort of co-opted and used against us. And it's not just, the people at the top, it's the common carriers upon which we all rely. AT&T was recently exposed in the New York Times as being a partner of the NSA who goes beyond what is required by law. Even if you believe the claims of politicians who say, we have the involvement of a secret court, a rubber stamp court, and that's better than nothing, right? You can rely on judges, even if they're not held to the account of the public. Even by those low standards, classified documents, which are never shared with the public, indicate that they violate even that low bar of law and policy thousands of times per year, 2,776 in a single year. And each one of those counts is not one intercepted phone call. This is an actual case. One of those 2,776 times was intercepting every phone call in a Washington, D.C. area code for a period of days. This affects thousands or even millions of people. And the question is, how do we recover from these kind of things? What does policy mean when policy is not ours?
You're speaking here virtually on a college campus to a room that's mostly filled with students. How are people supposed to, therefore, how do you advise students and the rest of citizens to interact with these organizations that you're criticizing? The US government, the National Security Agency, AT&T, et cetera. Not work for them, try to find whatever files of theirs they can and release them to the public. How are particularly people going out in the world supposed to interact with these institutions? Ignore them, not be on Facebook?
So this is a difficult question for me because I'm not a politician. I'm not a leader, and I don't want to be. I'm an engineer who simply saw something that I thought people should know. And I was sworn by oath the first day that I entered the Central Intelligence Agency to protect the Constitution of the country against all enemies, all threats, foreign and domestic. But if you want my candid thoughts, which really should be questioned because this is not my expertise here, I think it's a conversation that we should all be considering individually, familially, and communally. Look at your friends, think about what they think they can do. In the context of companies, there's a very easy way to punish them, which is not to cooperate. If you work for an organization or think you could work for an organization on the inside, there are many ways of resistance. There's either political resistance, there's protest, there's even direct action, where you see something wrong and you actively try to change the system. And this is a fundamental point, I think a really key point. that we're losing, and this is what was not asked on the stage of the Democratic debate, and I think is quite sad, is why are we in a situation today, for example, with your reporting on the drone papers yesterday, where the policies that have the most impact on the nature of our society, what the government is doing in our name, and occasionally and sometimes even often against us, why can these things not be debated with the public? Why can we not seem to have a say in them? Why can we not have these issues heard in an open court until an individual, an ordinary citizen, risks their freedom or their life to come out and share this with the press in a circumstance that we know is going to get them punished? We have seen this again and again, not just since 2001, but even going back to Daniel Ellsberg. And the thing is, if we are structuring our society in such a way that we can't know the truth and we can't even discuss the truth unless someone self-nominates to light themselves on fire, and then we just call these people whistleblowers, we'll very quickly find ourselves without whistleblowers. And what do we do then?
Is that an argument in favor of whistleblowing or against whistleblowing?
I think it's an argument in favor of reform.
So the,
You might answer the same question in exactly the same way, but I'd like to ask it again. Is that an argument in favor of whistleblowing or against whistleblowing?
I think it shows that, let's take the case of Thomas Drake, for example. This is an extraordinarily brave, principled individual. He was a senior executive working at the NSA. And by senior executive, I mean literally his pay grade was in what's called the senior executive series. This was an individual at the top of the chain who had a very charmed life, who had to do relatively little work in exchange for extraordinary rewards. And he saw that the Bush administration had said, we're going to spy on everybody in the country because it might stop an attack. Now, there's an argument to be made that maybe it would stop an attack. We now know 10 years later that it didn't, and this is not my claim. This is the government's own claim. They did an investigation, a review, and they found that in no case had his phone records interception program of mass surveillance made, quote, a concrete difference in a single terrorism investigation. It had never stopped an imminent domestic terrorist threat at all. But he saw this. He tried to report it internally, again, went to 2 inspector generals, went to Congress. He used the traditional sort of whistleblowing process that the government is now actively encouraging people do this. And what did they do? They charged him with the Espionage Act, many different counts, and they tried to put him in jail for the rest of his life. They prosecuted him for a number of years. He went through all of his savings. I believe he lost his wife as a result. And now, rather than being a senior executive at the National Security Agency, he works at an Apple store at like the Genius Bar. But this is how the public eventually learned, allegedly, what was going on. It wasn't through this internal constrained process within the government that destroyed his life. It was by talking to a journalist. And even if it didn't change it immediately then, even if it took 10 more years and more whistleblowers, we've seen that it ultimately changes policy. It ultimately changes the law. In the case of my accounts in 2013, working with the press to reveal mass surveillance, the very first program that I revealed has been declared unlawful by the courts, and it has been ended by an act of Congress. That's something that... And this is something that we increasingly see, and again, I can't emphasize enough the drone reporting that happened yesterday with the drone papers, because these technologies, these policies, they have a sort of history of moving from war front to home front. These programs of sort of surveillance are always tested out against people who the American public would not be concerned even if there were rights violations occurring. There's a program called Shenanigans, appropriately enough, where NSA engineers worked with the CIA to create a pod that you would put on the bottom of drones. It would fly in orbits around cities in places like Yemen and it would track the locations on the basis of the wireless emanations that come off of all of our devices, the iPhone that's in your pocket, the laptop that's in your lap that has a wireless card in it. These things radiate out into space, and an airplane can catch them. Every single one of them has a unique hardware identifier, which is called a universally unique identifier, and won't be replicated by anyone else's device. So ultimately, if you do this enough, you can track which cities people live in, which houses they live in on a mass scale, where they're at, when they've moved, when they've changed locations. And you might go, okay, well, this is stopping terrorism, it's all right. But the Wall Street Journal reported just last year that the same program is now being used in the United States, not to stop terrorism, but against common criminals. The Marshals Service is using it to find people who have jumped bail and things like that. And it's this slippery slope, the same way with targeting things like drone attacks, where the policies of one president become the policies of another. And now we have targeted attacks, drone attacks, that are claiming the lives even of American citizens. This is Anwar or Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki. He is the son of someone who was targeted for assassination by the Bush administration, a US person, who they did not like because of his radical politics, that he said he was a radicalizer, he was an extremist. And now he's dead because he was struck with a missile, and he's not alone. He is one of thousands of people who have died by the hand of a policy about which we have never been able to have any meaningful input in or review over. And thanks to some extraordinary whistleblower who provided this information to The Intercept, we now know that these drone attacks that claim the lives of innocents, despite the claims of the government, 90% of the time, 9 out of 10 people killed are not the intended targets. They're people who just happen to be nearby. And this is something that we would never have any ability to change or even be allowed to know, if not for some individual who risked their own liberty for the rest of ours.
Yeah, you're making lots of different ideas come into my head, but one of them that I keep thinking about has to do with the nature of celebrity and the fact that you have, I guess, what we could call something like a dark celebrity at the moment, and I'm concerned about the fact that in America, particularly, what we do is we assign to single persons a whole role. You have a very particular role right now, and you have a voice that speaks wonderfully from that role. But there's a kind of way in which you then almost are consigned to being an icon or a symbol of a set of very important ideas. Is there any way in which you imagine that your way of articulating these issues can stay issues and also can inspire people to act there's something about consensus here. So maybe everybody in this room is totally on your side. Then we say goodbye to you, and you go back to your dark celebrity, and then we have to try and think about, well, what should we be doing? Well, everybody in the room is not going to be a whistleblower because we don't even have access to the kind of information that you and others have. But the question, we've talked a lot over the last 2 days about technology, and so the question is there any, do you have any sort of strong sense of what kinds of actions people, as in the people in this room, might take to confound or oppose or shift the ground so that we're not just depending on your voice? That's really my point, is that we're just depending on you to articulate this, and then we all feel a little bit better because it's been articulated, but we're still without very much agency, I think.
Well, I agree, and I think agency is critical. I would push back and say I don't agree with the characterization of celebrity. I don't like the labeling I don't like the elevation of whistleblowers. There's this whole traitor hero argument. They're like, which side are you on? I reject both because even though people say being a hero would be a good thing, it's otherizing, it's distancing. It says that, this person did something I could never do in that situation. That's absolutely not true. Now, yes, you may not be in that circumstance, but that is the nature of whistleblowing. And that is actually, I think, ultimately, the nature of action in general. Whistleblowers are elected by circumstance. It's not about who you are. It's not about what your credentials are. It's about what you see, what you witnessed, and ultimately the choice to do something that changed it. And that happens throughout society on every issue. Not everything is a national security issue, but even in the context of privacy, of security, of surveillance, the reason mass surveillance has become so attractive as a policy is because governments around the world and bad actors around the world, even criminal groups, hacker organizations, have realized the nature of communications is that you have 2 points. You can either attack either of those points that are communicating the endpoints, this computer or that computer, this computer or that phone, and read everything on them, but that doesn't scale. Instead, they go for the communications that are passing in transit, which by virtue of the fact that we're using communications standards and technologies that were developed in, for example, the 1980s, everything is being transmitted electronically naked. So when you send an SMS to your friend, anybody in the midpoint, anyone across the internet who sees that message can take it, they can store it, they can save it, they can read it, they can do whatever they want with it. And this is the AT&T problem that we discussed earlier. If you embrace new technologies like encrypted communication, you can armor your technologies, you can clothe your communications so that they can transit more safely. Now, this doesn't resolve the problem of metadata association, which is, I think, too complex to get into in the point of this talk. But the idea here is that while an adversary can observe the fact that these two phones did communicate, they had some association, they can't tell what was actually said. And this is a step forward, and this is really the key, is to think about steps that you can take to do this. Now, the most critical part of this is you go, of course, well, we don't know what to do. And this is ultimately what university is about. This is not just what education, or not just what schooling is about, but what education is about learning, about the nurturing of capability, of capacity. Read. That's the first thing you have to do. Read, criticize, think, decide for yourself what to do. In this context, I can give you advice. I can tell you, if you have an iPhone or an Android phone and you want to communicate with any of your peers who also has a smartphone in the room, download an app called Signal. If you use Signal to communicate with these people, your calls will be unbreakably encrypted, and your SMSs that you send through this program will also, they won't be able to be read if they're intercepted. And enough people do things, when enough people do things like this, the value of mass surveillance drops, which is a net positive for the world. Because again, the dynamic problem, the engineering problem, when we think about how we got here, the incentives are simply too high for governments, for private actors, whatever, to break the rules and to target everyone in mass because it's easy and it's cheap. If we make that difficult and hard, they're forced to target people on an individualized basis rather on the scale of populations.
Can I just ask you what you'd like to read?
I'm sorry?
What do you like to read? I understand.
the internet, actually. I would name a particular group or magazine or newspaper, but this is, I think, one of the great values and beauties of the internet is that it does not constrain you to readership. It doesn't constrain you to this or that group. You can reach across borders, across languages, across outlets and institutions to get a diversity of views that allowed me as a young man, based on the pseudonymity or the anonymity that the internet can eventually provide, to go across tribes, to get the other viewpoints, to read Foreign Policy magazine or something like that, which may be a little bit more favorable to the state, and then read things that are a little bit more critical, to read simply the comments of ordinary people, their ideas, their thoughts. That's what informs me the most. When people say sort of, I'm championing these ideas, or they try to elevate me as a thinker, I'm not. A great original thinker. I wasn't sitting troubled at the NSA, trying to puzzle out the mystery of the universe. I was simply part of a larger body of humanity who saw that something was going on and thought it was wrong. I listened to their arguments, and from them I derived my own. And that is what I would recommend that everyone do.
I'd like to ask you a question about Twitter, because you just recently joined the rest of the half of humanity, it seems, in opening up a Twitter account. And you quickly accumulated like 1.4 million followers, which is not quite Justin Bieber levels, which is about 70 million, but it's not bad. And you've been doing it so much that your lawyer told you to stop, and then you said you needed to get a new lawyer on Twitter, and then you had to tell lawyers not to keep DMing you because you were just joking. But somewhat seriously, Twitter is a very public platform, and you've been very personal, surprisingly so, in what you've been tweeting. So the question I'd like to ask, in a sense, in the context of this conference, privacy and surveillance, is why you have adopted or joined this kind of privacy negating platform, what you're hoping to accomplish by it, and how you think you've been doing.
So there is, this actually gets into a broader point, which is about the internet in general and the public nature of it. But I think that's very different from saying someone is adopting positions that are contrary to a valuing of privacy rights. Now, the key here is that the value of privacy, the value of these services, is about being able to share selectively, being able to share constructively. We decide the parts of our lives just as we do in a conversation. We pick the words that we share with those around us. We pick the ideas that we communicate with people out on the internet. And I think this is valuable, and I think that this is something to be cherished and embraced. Now, of course, I use privacy-enhancing technologies to prevent things being taken from me involuntarily or being exploited, even if it's in a contractual agreed upon relationship. For example, through the end user licensing agreements that on many of these sites are extremely abusive, allow them to collect information about you and then share them and resell them and do whatever they want with them. And these kind of privacy enhancing technologies, for example, the Tor project, T-O-R, that you can download, that provide a locational anonymity. You may still log into Facebook. You may still log into Twitter. So Twitter knows you're there. It's got a picture of your face or whatever, but they don't know where you are when you're connecting to the service. They don't know that you're at the hospital. They don't know that you're with your family unless you choose to share that. And I think this point of consent is really the single most important factor that's missing from the mainstream policy positions of whether they're candidates for president or governments more broadly, universally around the world. When I think about what the American project is about, what the Bill of Rights says when you stop looking at each particular amendment and you start looking at the broad aggregation of points, it's about voluntary participation. It's about the fact that we are not accountable to a government if it is not accountable to us. But increasingly, we see within our society, we have individuals who, because of these mechanisms, because of things like the fact that Facebook records every IP address, every computer that you've ever used to connect to it permanently, and then will happily share that with any government that asks, we are more transparent today as a public than we ever have been before. At the same time, the governments around the world, and this is not a US issue, this is a global problem that needs global solutions. The same time that government officials, privileged officials, whether they are billionaires or bureaucrats, are exempting themselves from the same standards of accountability and behavior, whether it's through a two-tracked, two-tiered system of justice. That means a poor individual will be arrested or killed on the street for a minor violation of rights, or the application of a state secrets regime that says no matter how grievous the wrongdoing, no matter how terrible the violation of rights, we can literally bomb a hospital and we can get away with it because who can stop us as a government? The people who occupy the positions of the greatest power in society should be held to the greatest standards of accountability, not the opposite. That's a problem, and I think that's fundamentally the point that we have to resolve.
You mentioned Facebook right there, and with all the caveats that this question obviously comes with, if you put out for a point of discussion, is Facebook the corporate NSA in the sense of accumulating information about people, not sharing it with them necessarily, doing it secretly? What would you say, particularly to an audience like this here? I assume most people here, particularly university audience, are avid users of Facebook, as are a very, very large number of people in this country.
I think it ultimately comes down to trust and trusted relationships, right? There are ways that you can have social networks that have ad-supported models and things like that are not exploitative. It's not that the idea of social media is the greatest evil. It's something that we should, reject totally. But it's something that we should control. It's something that we should be able to trust. And the problem today is that these large organizations, not exclusively Facebook, they're unwilling to make a commitment to the user. They really need to decide who they work for. The government or some advertiser, or broadly the basic people who take advantage of their services. And again, there are ways to balance these interests, but it's very clear that that balance has gone far out of alignment. However, we can see ways forward that if companies prove to be worthy of our trust, at least of new promises, because we know the ones in the past that they've made, they've broken. For example, Apple here has said that they're no longer interested in collecting and selling your data. They're interested in simply selling you devices of products and services. They're not going to resell you in the same way. And that is something that, again, we don't know whether it's true or not. We don't know whether we can trust them. If it proves over time to be reliable, could show us the way forward to a new model where we actually can retain trusted relationships with companies and services that benefit not just their shareholders, but the public and ultimately the world.
I guess this is a good, maybe close to final question, although I think there's some other questions coming from Twitter. American pragmatists thought a lot about consequences in terms of making choices. And I'm curious about whether or how you thought about the consequences for you personally in this action, and simultaneously very interested in how you are imagining the future, like how you might have a thought experiment about where you're going to be in 10 years and what you're going to be doing and what you'd like to be doing. I think we'd all like to know maybe part of that answer.
I will say, actually, this gets back to sort of the democratic debate question earlier. The characterization there was that many candidates wanted to prosecute me. And the implication is that that's a negative trend. But I would actually argue that the statements on the stage of the democratic debate were an extraordinary leap forward in terms of recognition by the establishment that the actions of 2013 were not so harmful as initially claimed. I don't think anybody important used the word traitor. It was certainly not applied universally, which in 2013 it was. And this is because there is sort of that clash of ideas, that conflict of contest of interests, where of course they have to take positions. If they want to be in charge of this system, they're not going to want to undermine the power of that system. They want to retain it in sort of the most well-resourced, most influential way because they want to captain it. So that's normal, that's natural, that doesn't surprise me. But it's that change in rhetoric where in 2013, people were saying, you know, the sky is going to ignite, the oceans are going to boil off, everybody's going to die, terrorists are going to get through. And now in 2015, despite the fact that we've brought the director of NSA, CIA, and so on and so forth in before Congress to give testimony about this, they've never shown a single instance where any individual has been harmed or died as a result of this journalism. Or even a national security interest has been implicated in any particularized way. And this is critical because when we think about these tough questions and how do we balance them, for example, people say we need to have a balance between privacy and security. That's completely false. It's not only disingenuous, I think it's intentionally misleading. Because these are actually parallel goals. The more private you are, the safer you are, the more protected you are. We can increase both of these goals together. Anybody who's saying you need to give up privacy to get security is creating a false dilemma to get you to abandon the position of saying that my rights can be protected. And we can also maintain the means of traditional investigation that, by the way, we actually do have evidence does thwart terrorist plots. It does capture criminals. Justice has to be seen to be done. It's an open court that convicts someone and gives the public faith that the system can work in a fair way. When you've got closed sessions, when you've got classified evidence, when you've got people who have the book thrown at them for minor offenses, they don't make us more safe. They don't make us more secure. They might make a structure or a system more stable, but I think they actually increase the general level of conflict that exists within a society.
I think Roger now has some questions from the audience members.
So thank you. We're very grateful for you speaking to us, Mr. Snowden. Is this on? Yeah. I have one question sent from someone here at Bard, and it's that we have students at different Bard campuses in Germany, Russia, Kyrgyzstan, and the West Bank, and also in New York, watching today. And I wonder, and part of the idea is to give them some different perspectives. I was wondering if you have anything to say to them.
When we think about the sort of explosion of connectivity that's happening around the world, but also the different positions taken by many governments, whether it's the Russian government's crackdown on sort of how you can love one another, how you can associate, can you hold hands in public and things like that. Oh my gosh, the children might see. Or their crackdown on internet freedoms, the same things that we see happening in China, the same things that we see Latin America. And in new cases, quite frightening cases, we see the same thing happening in the UK. We see the same thing happening in France. We see the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, David Cameron, saying, we can't allow conversations to occur within our society to which the government is not privy. These things are dangerous. And this is something that needs to make us think on a level that's higher than national laws. We cannot rely on even the most enlightened parliament of any society to really protect human rights within its singular, within border sphere of influence alone. And this raises the question of, well, how can we? And there is a controversy about this, but the idea is we have to search for new means, new mechanisms of enforcing human rights for new times, for new situations, for new circumstances. And this is why technologies like encryption actually make me optimistic for the future, despite the grave challenges that we face, despite the gradually increasing authoritarian gravity we see in political centers around the world. People who occupy positions of influence, who hold a claim to the greatest percentage of resources in society, their watchword, the most beautiful sound today is stability. And this is persuasive to many people. Of course, we all want to be safe. We all want to be peaceful. But I get the feeling that their idea of what stability means is quite different from that of the public's at large. And while we in the United States could, things could change, we can imagine, at least in our dreams, sort of the perfect fantasy world where there's a sweep of reform, it's a golden era, a renaissance of civil and political rights. But as soon as, for example, in the context of surveillance, our communications cross beyond our borders, all of those protections vanish. But if we invest in science and technology, if the students sitting in this room, undergraduates, smart grad students, cooperate and collaborate to develop new mechanisms of communication, new systems, new protocols, new ways of thinking, new ways of sharing, new ways of describing it, new ways of making the argument, we can extend and enforce the guarantees of human rights that we inherited ourselves, not just to the next generation in our country, but around the world.
Thank you very much. The questions are coming in fast and furious on cards and on Twitter. I'm going to actually introduce one of our students who had wanted to ask you a question. His name is Sam Reed, and I'm going to try and collate some of these. So, Sam, please come up.
Thanks for speaking with us today. I don't know if you can see me. But I know from very early on you've said that you would be willing to stand trial in the United States given certain conditions. So I'm curious as to what you think the value of that is and what is preventing you, or what you see is preventing you from doing so.
So this is actually a really interesting question. My lawyer tells me never to talk about this. I talk about it anyway. But the idea here is that I actually am not that radical when it comes to the political spectrum. I'm not very far left. I'm not very far right. I'm quite far away from the sort of authoritarian axis of political identity. But when it comes to structure, when it comes to sort of traditional mechanisms of the United States, should we support this? Should we uphold the courts? Should we uphold sort of the standard mechanisms of Congress? Should we support the military and so on? It's actually been quite difficult for me even to question these supremacies because, again, the way I was raised, the way I grew up, I love this country, I love this system, and I want to see it thrive. And when I said this, for example, in previous interviews, when I said this on the internet, particularly on Twitter recently, where people could contact me directly, the response shocked me because everyone said, "You fool. What are you thinking? Why would you volunteer yourself to a justice system which everyone knows leads the world in incarcerations? The fairness of trials is actually not only not guaranteed, it's extremely rare. You see people for minor drug crimes and so on and so forth. Their lives are ruined, they're labeled. Why would you support that system?" And I suppose this is a challenge where I should develop my thinking and think more deeply about it, but I focus so much on the work that's not related to me, but instead related to the technologies and how we resolve these political issues, that it hasn't been my focus. But what I asked for was I wanted a fair trial. I wanted an open trial. I wanted to be able to argue to the jury why I did this. Now, the laws under which I was charged prohibit this. Daniel Ellsberg, for example, when he was tried in the Nixon administration, he was forbidden from putting forth evidence that would exonerate him. He was prohibited from even, or actually Thomas Drake, much more recently, post-2000, was forbidden from even uttering the word whistleblower in trial because the government said your motives are irrelevant. They have no public interest. They have no space in this courtroom. And as I talked to the government about this, and I said, look, I don't want to tear down the system. I don't want to burn it to the ground. I want people to be able to have faith in it. I want to help people believe in it. I want to help improve it. They said, well, we won't torture you. But we haven't gotten beyond that yet. So maybe room for growth.
Thank you very much. There's a number of questions that have come based on one of our earlier talks. One of our keynote speakers at the conference was David Brin. And David himself has put up a question, and it is something along the lines of, given that fact that the inspector generals of the different agencies in the US government have failed, would it make sense to try and create an independent inspector general office in some way that they would all have to report to? Other other questions relating to him. He talked a lot about surveillance. I don't know if that's a term you're familiar with. Surveillance from below instead of from above. And the idea being that there would be pretty much with the proliferation of cameras faster than Moore's law on computer speed, we're just not going to avoid surveillance. So we might as well give everybody cameras and fight back that way. And there's a couple of questions about how practical or worthwhile you think that approach is. And then one other question on these on this same idea is that there's been a fair bit of talk about how the attempt to escape surveillance through encryption is an elite response that won't really help most people. So there are three questions related to is the attempt to move towards encryption and hiding going to work, or should we sort of embrace the openness that's coming inevitably, and in doing so try and fight back with more inspector generals, other ways, independent watchdogs, and citizen brigades and citizen cameras?
Let me see if I can try to sort of unify those into a single general response. The first one is that encryption is an elite response. And of course, if you're thinking about, yes, I can exempt myself from these systems, I can do that, that's true. But that's not the goal, right? That's tactical rather than strategic. The idea is that for the people who have elite privilege, who have access to a voice, to a platform, to the education and capabilities to design these systems, to actually systematize them so they are no longer elite. Not for you to protect yourself, but to develop mechanisms, standards, protocols, and technologies, the invisible systems that surround us and that we rely upon every day, and use them in a manner that protects everyone by default, without even their awareness. People don't need to know that encryption is occurring for it to be there. These are well-known mechanisms. They've existed for many years, decades. It's simply up to us to find a transparent, low-friction way of implementing them. So the idea is actually not to protect yourself, not to embrace elitism, but to actually lower sort of the barrier to that and stop it from being a privilege and transform it into an expectation, transform it into an entitlement. Beyond that, the idea of sort of surveillance and just, should we give up on surveillance and use it from below? These are individual choices. It's all about how do we express ourselves politically, how do we engage, how do we contest the systems and the policies which we recognize are unjust. But I would say that the idea here is framing this as an argument about surveillance is a mistake to begin with. It's not really about whether it's surveillance or surveillance. It's about who has power and control within a society, who really rules within a democracy. Is it the people? Are we the ones who have the most influence on the outcome of elections? Are we the ones who determine what laws are and are not adopted? And we know from recent research that that's not the case, actually, that the public has the least influence on what laws become the actual law of the land in this country. Rather, it would be elite economic actors, think tanks that are sort of the arms of operations of very well-resourced actors and so on and so forth. These are the things that we want to change. Think about control there in that context. Surveillance is ultimately not about safety. Surveillance is about power. Surveillance is about control. So when you think about surveillance, when you think about turning the camera to face the other direction, that can actually be a very promising thing for society. Again, when we talked about accountability earlier and the fact that we are now watched, but we have no idea what's going on behind the closed doors in government. That is the central problem. We need our government to be transparent at the same time that we need privacy. Privacy is for the powerless, not for the privileged. Transparency is for those who wield the power. Accountability is for those who have the decisional authority to shape the direction of our future. And that's what we need to sort of enforce. And if there was a third point that I didn't address there, please remind me.
Ed, it's Peter here. Just to follow up what you just said, I don't want to distill it down to a slogan, but it sounds like in some ways what, the idea of surveillance is to fight surveillance with surveillance. And I just want to ask you, kind of throw it out there, I mean, isn't it kind of like an arms race of surveillance in that case? That individuals probably individually or collectively, would have a very hard time winning versus the government and corporations?
Only if it's a fair fight. The idea is that you would allow carte blanche to these great actors, who have all these resources and whatnot. But the idea is we need reform beyond this issue of surveillance. What we're seeing today, the problem of the NSA, again, is not about who holds the camera, what they're tracking. It's about the influence that it has. It's about the threat that it represents. It's about the fact that every citizen in every place has private records being stolen from them and tracked and stored and aggregated in databases that are available to be used against us. And it happens in advance of any criminal suspicion, without any suspicion of an individualized wrongdoing. And this is something that's not really about surveillance. It's about the balance of power. So again, we see the same thing happening in the context of the economy, where we have a permanently indentured underclass of youth who don't have any guarantees of access to jobs, of resources, of privilege, of influence, until they spend the next 20 or 25 years paying off an education that in most cases would be available to them for free, and in previous generations wouldn't be asked of them at all.
So I'm going to invite up Nathaniel Carlson, who's going to ask a question.
Hi, thank you for speaking with us today. So my question is that the sort of system of mass surveillance can be viewed largely as a response to the attacks on September 11th, 2001. How, and more importantly, why do you believe that this sort of external threat perpetrated by a group of persons operating outside of the United States resulted in the sort of internal surveillance of the American public?
That's a great question. The answer is not really reassuring, unfortunately. So why was an external group of actors who never represented an existential threat to the United States? And again, we know this from the government's words, not from a claim of my own. Terrorists were never going to be able to destroy the nation. They are a real threat. They are criminal groups, but there are many criminal groups around the world. You can look at the number of lives that are claimed by guns each year. You can look at the number of lives that are claimed by automobile accidents this year. If we're going to declare a war on terror that claims 3,000 lives in a year, why aren't we declaring a war on heart disease that's claiming orders of magnitude more? And the reality here is because it's actually about political influence. It's about political desire for organizations, for groups, to entitle themselves to a greater level of influence and control within the context and operation of a society. There was a very revealing, I encourage everyone to read it, a story that was published in the Washington Post very recently about arguments regarding encryption that were occurring secretly within the intelligence community, where they wanted to figure out how can they stop companies like Apple and Google from offering encryption on their smartphones. And if they're going to do it anyway, how can they create a back door where they can secretly sneak into your phone and pull whatever they want off of it? And there were all kinds of proposals, like literally requiring you to pay for a physical port where the police could plug a device into your phone, or changing methods of encryption, mandating legislation that would allow them to weaken, or that would require them to weaken encryption so the government could look at anybody's communications they want. And the administration said, we're not going to do this. They said, we can't do this. And the reason they said why is not because they lacked the power, not because they didn't think they could pass the law, but because they thought there would be backlash. They thought people would criticize them. They thought congressmen would lose their seats if they did something that was such an outrageous violation of the traditional operations of civil protections in this country. And yet, the top lawyer of the director in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, his name is Robert Litt, he wrote an email, which, very encouraging to me, it was leaked within a month to the Washington Post, that said we shouldn't give things up here. We should keep our options open, because the next time a terrorist attack or criminal event occurs, we can take advantage of that. This is what really happened. These capabilities, for example, Patriot Act which was a bill that was extraordinarily long, pages upon pages upon pages, of course was not written overnight. It was already on the shelf. It had been considered before, but they didn't have a political moment in which they could pass it. Suddenly, in the wake of this national trauma, they did. And they exploited that. And this is typical of government. This doesn't show what you would think extraordinarily bad faith on a number or on a particular individual actor. Dick Cheney is probably one of the worst people in the world, but you can't blame everything on him because in every administration, there is a Dick Cheney. There is always someone like this. And what we see is there is this natural inclination to go, what's our wish list? What would we do if we could do anything? And in the most extreme moments of emotional vulnerability of a traumatized public, that is when people who are in the positions of most authority see the most opportunity.
So thank you. And we're actually going to have an opportunity to hear from Mr. Litt after you speak. So
I'd encourage you to ask him about that.
I think it's an important discussion to have. I have a question here that was come over the internet. You were very eloquent in your defense of your actions and choices. It will take years, if not decades, to understand the ramifications on both national security and benefits to civil liberties. How do you make the calculus of whether it was worth it or not?
It's so difficult for me to answer this question because things have changed in such an extraordinary and overwhelming way. Things have gone so well, so far beyond my expectations that it's difficult for me to articulate. When I walked out of the NSA on the last day, I expected to go to jail. I didn't expect to even make it out of Hawaii. My only intention was to get this information into the hands of journalists so that we could understand what was going on. I didn't want to change the policies of society. I didn't want to say what you can and can't do. I didn't want to force a shift in the law. What I wanted was to give the people the information that they needed to be able to decide for themselves the kind of reforms that they wanted. And sitting here in 2015, being invited to speak at universities, being given awards, being thanked by presidential candidates for educating the public, is something that's really extraordinary because the other thing is I didn't do this out of a sense of altruism either. I wasn't trying to, save the world. I was just trying to live the kind of activities to create the world that I myself wanted to live in. I care about the internet. I care about our ability to pick up the phone and call our family or people we love, or even just, a political organization or church without having to think about what that looks like or how that's going to be misinterpreted by some analyst sitting at the very same desk that I occupied. There are people who can say, that's right, that's wonderful. I'm sure you'll get very compelling arguments from other individuals. But for me, that's wrong. And that's not only un-American, it's inhuman. And that's not the kind of world I want to live in.
I'm going to invite up another Bard student, Leon Derrier.
Mr. Snowden, you've put your life on the line for the purpose of making government more transparent, and at the same time you fight for the privacy of the individual. Is this a contradiction? If the citizen has a right to privacy, why doesn't then a group of citizens, the government, also gain this right of privacy? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a good question, but I think ultimately it comes down to the fact that governments operate in a power of privilege. They hold control over the monopoly of force. They can change people's fates. They can change the outcomes of society. They can order military drafts that affect everyone in every home. They can change the policies of our economy. They can print currency that reduces the value of the salient things that are in our pockets. There are so many ways that governments impact every single individual in ways that are not reflectively held in the same manner by individuals. That's the reason that they have to be held to a higher standard of accountability, is because they have a correspondingly, and actually I would say exponentially, much greater level of power and influence as a result. And we see this happening not just in the context of policy, of law, not just in whether they exercise these programs. For example, an individual who defends these programs goes, look, we have to collect this information because if we don't, it's ephemeral. It won't be there. It won't be in our databases after an attack. And we want to be able to go back in time and see what any arbitrary individual did. Now, setting aside the fact that no police force, no intelligence organization in the history of humanity has ever entitled itself to this power of being able to watch everyone all of the time, being able to track their activities just in case, simply knowing that that's occurring shapes human behavior. I mean, there have been studies done about this that show something as simple as putting a pair of eyes on a poster on the wall will shape human behavior for an extraordinary percentage of the population. And the idea is, if they're going to watch us to such an intrusive, extraordinary, invasive level, shouldn't we at least be able to get the bare facts, the mere outlines of the policies that they're enacting? We don't necessarily need to know every single activity, every terrorist that's targeted, things to that granularity, because not only would it not be in the public interest, but there could be a valid argument to be made that that should be withheld completely. But the idea is we should at least know the outlines. We should at least be able to know the directions so we can influence them. And if they argue that, yes, this is the case, we should have this debate, I believe that you should know about this, why did they avoid it for more than 10 years?
It's Peter here. I'm just wondering, without putting you on the spot, the student who just asked the question, would you like to follow it up in any way? And I have just put you on the spot.
Thank you for your response, and that highlights it. I don't know. Kind of.
You don't have to. Don't let
sorry,
it put
no,
out there. You don't have to.
No, that makes things clear. But at the same time, I get the sense when you say that because government has these privileges, in a way, you're being quite elitist yourself. You're making yourself the elite by saying that we should have more power. What would your response be?
I understand your point. I mean, the idea is that I would sort of be arrogating myself into a position of decisional authority. But the question is, from where did that mandate derive? Did I simply wake up one morning and say that, yes, I'm going to do this, this is all me? I would argue that no, that's not the case. For example, there are individuals in government who would argue that I violated an oath of secrecy. I will tell you that there is no oath of secrecy. There is no place in government where you swear, to raise your hand and keep secrets, particularly ones about serious wrongdoing, about criminal harm, about violations of the Constitution, happening on a massive scale that impact the lives of every single American citizen, and beyond that, the other 95% of the population around the world. You sign instead somebody will have to get me, but it's a standard form, fact check me in the audience, a non-disclosure agreement on behalf of the government that says you'll incur civil penalties, you could risk, this, that, or the other response, which of course you recognize. But there's that point when I entered onto duty at the Central Intelligence Agency, when I'm sitting in McLean, Virginia, in the auditorium with everyone else, and they ask you to raise your hand, not to defend the government as a particular body, not to defend a president, not to defend an agency, but to defend the Constitution. When these oaths come into conflict, when your obligations have tension, to what do you owe your first loyalty? For me, I wasn't trying to arrogate myself to a greater position of power. Instead, I was simply trying to keep the promises that I made, not just to the Central Intelligence Agency, not just to my government, not just to my country, but to the human family upon which we all rely.
Thank you.
we have a question from Martin Legros in Paris from Philosophy Magazine. He writes, to live entirely a private life means above all to be deprived of things essential to be truly human life, to be deprived of the reality that comes from being seen and heard by others. And he's quoting here Hannah Arendt. And the question is, what do you imagine a private life to be, and what is important about a private life that surveillance is deeply interfering with?
I think the idea here is not to take the lesson that we have to move to a cabin in the woods to be safe, to be private. To live a truly private life in a philosophical sense, that may be true. But what is the purpose of a right? Because we have the right to speech does not demand us to speak. Because we have the right to a free press, to work as a journalist, to publish, does not obligate us to all work as journalists, or else journalism schools would be, I think, have much larger graduating classes than they currently do. The right to privacy does not obligate us to live perfectly private lives. Instead, it's about being able to protect the things that matter to us, that we want to keep to ourselves, or that we want to selectively reveal to those we love, to those we trust. But at the same time, you're not obligated to cut yourself off from society. You're not obligated to cut yourself off from your friends. You're not obligated to limit yourself in any way, but you do have that right.
Can I follow? You're remarkably articulate and eloquent, and it makes me think that you have, at some level, thought about language itself. And I'm wondering, and also I'm very interested in your really quite profound faith in journalism. I'm wondering if you believe that language is still something that can operate as a vehicle for changing the way people think and act.
I think without language, there is no connection. How do you reach across space, particularly across distance, where you don't have physical proximity to convey ideas? How do you pass ideas beyond our lifespans? You have to have some system of writing, some system of encoding, some system of passage into something that's greater and beyond and external to yourself. And this is really, I think, the most beautiful story of civilization, is that we've moved beyond the tyranny of self, of meeting our human foundational needs of, food and warmth and things like that, and begun to coordinate, begun to build, begun to shape and begin to acculturate ourselves and see one another as something more than a competitor for a given resource. Now, I can't say that's the case in the context of intelligence and military organizations based on lived experience. But there is something beautiful in the demonstrated potential of connection and understanding and empathy, and ultimately faith in the goodness of people and things that are foreign to ourselves.
I can actually follow up on that question on language, if I might. We actually got a beautiful thought for Edward Snowden that was sent up by someone, I can't read the name, I have to admit. But after a small discourse on the Little Prince, it says that this morning Anne Lauterbach, right here, said that your actions, the gesture of Edward Snowden, are important, and not so much the information themselves, but the gesture. And that there was somewhere the metaphor of a flower. And I'd like to relate the courage you had to a flower that has been, in a sense, given to us, is what she writes. And I'm wondering, at a time when language is so powerless in many ways, what you think it is. What was the moment, or was there a moment, not when you decided to do what you did, you answered that question, but when your language broke through? I've heard many people say it was the movie, Citizen 4. I'm wondering, though, what you was it journalism? Was it the movie? Was it something you said? What do you think? Was there a metaphor, a gesture? What do you think broke through to people?
I don't actually think it was me at all. I think the most impact came immediately in the beginning because we weren't involved in the language of claims. We moved beyond the space of allegation. It wasn't about this person or that person or whether they're credible. It was about documents. And this is the real power of journalism, I think, is in the finding of fact, the establishment over time of what is and is not. And this is one of the most critical points that I think is lost in the daily operation of the press today, you know, whether we're talking about sort of the major institutions of cable news, which have become less credible and less reliable over time. They've become closer to industry and interest and government and structure and less interested in audience. And I think the idea here is that it's not enough to have a free press. It's not enough that we can simply write what we want. We also have a sense of what corresponds with that right, which is an obligation. What do we owe to structure and society? And this is not meant in a communist sense, but in a humanist sense, that when we are imbued with privilege, with protection, with guarantee of a given right, we should use it for good. And this means we shouldn't just have a free press, but we should have an adversarial press, which does not simply listen to government statements and transcribe them, but actively challenges them, engages in a muscular conflict, a contest with them, not to ask them for the truth, but to wrest it from them.
Thank you. We're going to bring up again Sam Reed, who asked you a question earlier, who's going to follow up.
Hey, so you talked about some of the reasons why you feel that meaningful whistleblowing are almost impossible within institutions and why you feel that it would be almost impossible for you to receive a fair trial in the United States. I was wondering what changes you would like to see to whistleblowing law and how whistleblowers are treated.
When we think about the context of how do we resolve conflicts of justice within our society, they almost always occur within a national context. If you're trying to assign culpability in the controversy of murder, of a trademark infringement or something like that, or whether somebody sped down the road of their city, the government in a national context, the national government, is very well placed to have some sort of role in that. But what happens when the government itself is the defendant? And this is the case in the context of political crimes. And this is why there's always been sort of political crimes that are non-extraditable. This is why exile in many cases has always been a thing. Is governments realize that even if they punish someone, they'll do it in a manner that's not credible and could actually risk their own reputation. Rather, they would force them out and try to divorce them from that. Now, in the changing context of the world today, we see that exile is losing its influence. The walls are breaking down. Governments can no longer keep out the voices they dislike. And this creates pressure and impetus for reform. And I think just as we have created international courts for the review and decision in regard to cases like war crimes for exactly this purpose, which is that governments do not typically reform themselves. Power admits nothing without a demand. You need some external force, some equal, some voluntary relationship on which, for the benefit of everyone, they impose upon themselves a voluntary restraint. Now, unfortunately, we all know in recent history in the United States government, they have worked quite hard, authorizing legislation, for example, to invade The Hague if a member of the military service who has committed a war crime is on trial there. This is something that I think we should revisit. To think about how can we ensure that we can guarantee justice, not just for an individual in a particular point of contact or context within our borders or within the traditional roles, but things that affect everyone all the way around the world? How can we create guarantees, not just of national rights, but of human rights?
Could I?
I think we need to finish up. So I want to thank very heartily Mr. Snowden for agreeing to talk to us for so long and so generously. And